I grew up in Newark, New Jersey, and went to college there as well. Some of my best friends were from all the way back to grade 4 or 5, but after I graduated, I moved across the country for a job. It was a big change leaving everything behind, but I was excited to start fresh. My friend group, which had been so close in college, had scattered to different parts of the country as well. Only a few of us stayed close to home. Despite the distance, we made an effort to stay in touch. We had a few Zoom calls each month to keep the connection alive. It wasn't the same as being together, but it was all we could do. I hadn't made many friends in my new city, so it was good to have some people to talk to. When my friend Jamie told me that he was getting married, I was excited to see everyone again. He invited all of us, so a reunion was finally happening. The wedding was going to be held at an old winery near a small town, far away from any major city. I planned to stay with Ronnie and Pat, two of my other friends. Pat was one of my best friends, but Ronnie was a different story. He was into drugs during college, and we never really clicked. Lately, though, he was just smoking weed, which didn't bother me as much. The three of us booked a room in the cheapest motel we could find. It wasn't very nice looking, but we figured it didn't matter, since we'd be spending most of our time at the wedding or out with friends. We agreed to split the cost, and I was just looking forward to catching up with Pat, as well as seeing everyone at the wedding. When the weekend came, I packed my bags and flew out. I met up with Pat at the airport, and we drove together to the small town where the wedding was happening. The drive was long, but we talked the whole way, so it flew by. We were both in a good mood, and I was excited to see Jamie, as well as the rest of the gang. When we arrived at the motel, though, my spirits dipped a little. The place was pretty run down, and looked much worse than the pictures on the website. It was sitting on the side of a dusty highway, with not much else around. There was a truck stop right across the street, and the noise from the highway was bad. I think we were on a major transit route. The motel wasn't as bad inside as it looked from the outside. The room was small but decent. It had 2 queen-size beds and a small cot, just like we requested. It was clean enough, and we figured it would do just fine for the couple of nights we'd be there. Ronnie hadn't arrived yet, so Pat and I settled in and waited for him. He showed up a bit later, and I could tell right away that not much had changed. He had the same laid-back attitude, and it wasn't long before he mentioned wanting to pick up some weed. I wasn't surprised. He was on his phone and started sending messages, trying to find someone in town who could sell him some. Pat and I didn't say much about it. We weren't into smoking, but it also didn't bother us. We just wanted to keep things chill. On that first day, we had the rehearsal, which went smoothly. It ended in the late afternoon. Then we had dinner with some of the other guests and headed back to the motel. By then it was late, and I was ready to just hang out in the room and relax before the big day. Back at the motel, Ronnie was still on his phone trying to find some weed. After a while, he got up and said he was going out to meet someone. Pat and I stayed behind watching the old fuzzy TV in the room. About 15 minutes later, Ronnie came back, but he wasn't alone. 2 guys came in with him, and they didn't look like the kind of people you want to run into in a place like this. They were sketchy to say the least. One of them sat down on the dresser in front of the beds, and the other stood by the door. Ronnie dug through his bag and then handed some money to one of them, but they didn't leave. The one by the door took a big step over, effectively blocking our only way out. Ronnie looked confused as he stood there in front of one of them. He looked over at me, then back to the drug dealer. Before I could say anything, one of the guys pulled out a knife. It wasn't a huge one, but it was enough to scare the crap out of me. He held it up towards Ronnie, who jumped back and almost tripped. The guy told Ronnie to get the rest of his cash, which he did. He handed over a wad of bills, then took a few steps away. The guy at the door stayed there, blocking it, while the other one started going through our stuff. He grabbed our phones, wallets, and they even took my shoes. Pat and I just sat there on the beds, not daring to move. Ronnie looked like he was in shock. It was like he couldn't believe what was happening. Once they had taken everything they could find, the guy with the knife motioned for his friend to leave. They backed out of the room, and then they were gone. As soon as the door shut behind them, Ronnie started crying. I was furious at him for bringing them there and putting us in this situation. Pat looked like he was ready to punch someone, and I didn't blame him. I almost punched Ronnie myself, but I held back. He tried to defend himself, but I wasn't in the mood to hear excuses. Ronnie said that he didn't want to bring cash to meet them, just in case they mugged him. Then he brought them back to get it, because they seemed like decent guys. It was a BS excuse, of course. Everyone knows that you don't bring strange drug dealers back to your room. Ronnie, of all people, should have known that. Because of him, we were stuck in a motel in the middle of nowhere without our phones or wallets. I couldn't believe how quickly things had gone wrong. We went down to the front desk and got the night manager to call the cops for us. It took them a while to show up, and when they did, they didn't seem too optimistic about catching the guys. We gave them all the details we could, but I could tell they'd seen this kind of thing before, and they weren't expecting to solve it. That night was ruined, and so was the weekend. The wedding still happened, but the whole thing left a bad taste in my mouth. I couldn't enjoy the rest of the trip, and I was glad to get out of that town as soon as possible. This happened when I was in my early 30s. I was managing a motel, and it was a job that I had been doing for just over a year. I had gotten the job through a friend from a previous job, but he was fired for stealing not long after I started. Against all odds, I ended up getting along with the owner really well, and I was promoted to night manager after less than 6 months. The place wasn't bad as far as motels go. It was part of a larger chain, so it was nice enough, and we never had many complaints. The motel sat off a highway that wasn't all that busy. We got some truckers late at night, but it was far from a major transit way, and the motel was rarely full. We were one of the cheaper places though, so we had that going for us. Shifts at that place were almost always the same. The most exciting thing that would usually happen would be a conversation with a person checking in. Even that was rare though. The front desk faced the parking lot, and beyond that was the road, so when things were slow, I'd watch the cars drive by. It was peaceful, but definitely a little dull. One night about a year into working there, I came in as usual as the sun was dipping below the horizon. It was a Wednesday, so the lot was mostly empty, and my coworker had only checked in 2 guests earlier that evening. I went in and talked with him for a bit before he took off for the night. Then I was all alone in the office. Hours went by without anything, but then at 3 in the morning, I was in the middle of a game on my phone, and I heard the rumble of an engine pulling into the lot. It was late for check-ins, but not unheard of, so I looked up from my phone and saw a car parking on the far side of the lot. A man and a woman got out, and they both seemed unusual right away. They were dressed too nicely for a place like this. The man was wearing a full suit, and the woman was wearing a beautiful dress. It was like they were coming back from the prom or something. They were too old for that, though, so maybe a wedding. That's what I thought anyway. The man came into the office while the woman stood by the car smoking a cigarette. He didn't make conversation, he just asked for a room and hardly even looked at me. However, he kept looking back toward the door. I handed him the paperwork, and he scribbled his name without really looking at it. Then he said something about needing privacy. He asked if I could make sure no one disturbed them. I told him that wouldn't be a problem, because I knew we were underbooked. It wouldn't be a problem to put him somewhere private. He left right after I gave him his key, and went back over to the car, where the woman was waiting. After the man left, I stayed at the window for a while, watching them. The woman was holding a small black bag. She had it clutched tight to her side, like she didn't want anyone to see it. It wasn't a purse. It looked more like a rolled-up garbage bag, which looked out of place considering how they were dressed. They weren't carrying any luggage, which was also strange. Usually people at least brought a duffel bag or a backpack, but they had nothing except that little bag. The man looked around the lot, like he was checking for something. Then they both headed to their room. There was something off about the whole thing, but I didn't know what it was at the time. I figured they just wanted to be left alone, and I wasn't one to ask questions. The night went on as usual after that. I made another coffee, then went back to scrolling through my phone. An hour passed, and I didn't hear a peep from their room. Then just when I had forgotten about them, I heard a loud thud. It sounded like something heavy had hit the wall hard, and it came from the direction of the man and woman that just checked in. It wasn't a gunshot, or like a door slamming, but it would have had to be a loud slam. There wasn't anybody else around there, so I knew that it probably came from them. I thought about calling the police, but part of me didn't want to overreact. I dealt with plenty of weird situations before, and most of them turned out to be nothing. Instead of calling anyone, I decided to check it out myself. I grabbed the spare key to their room and walked over. When I got to their door, I paused for a second to listen. I could hear muffled voices, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. It sounded like an argument, though. Then suddenly, the voices stopped and everything went silent. I waited there for another minute, but nothing happened, not a sound. I headed back to the office after that, because I thought it was nothing. About 15 minutes later, I heard the door slam again, but this time, the woman came running out of the room. She just bolted straight to the car and jumped in. Then she slammed the door and sped off. I watched as the car's taillights disappeared into the night. A second later, the man came out yelling after her. He was barefoot running across the lot, waving his arms and shouting. I couldn't make out what he was saying, but it was obvious she wasn't coming back. He kept running down the road after her, and he never came back. After about 5 minutes, I grabbed the spare key again and headed to their room to check it out. The door was unlocked and not even closed all the way, so I pushed it open. The place was a mess. The bed was half torn apart, and there was broken glass on the floor. One of the lamps from the bedside tables was smashed on the floor as well, but what caught my eye immediately was the black bag. It was sitting on the bed half open. I walked over and peeked inside. There were bags of what looked like drugs. Without going into too much detail, I have some experience with that kind of stuff, so it set off alarm bells right away. I went back to the office and called the police. When they arrived, they searched the room and took the bag as evidence. By that time, the sun was starting to come up and my shift would be over soon. I stuck it out for the next few hours, and I was glad to go home. I later learned that they found the man walking along the side of the highway that night. He was found over 6 miles from the motel, in bare feet and formal attire. A strange sight, I'm sure. As for the woman, she was gone, and I never heard anything more about her. I stayed at that job for a few years afterwards, and although I have moved on, I still think about that night every now and then. It's not something you forget. I was traveling for work last year, and that meant spending a lot of time on the road. They gave me a rental car to use, which was a newer Ford Focus. Without boring you with too many details, I work for a bank, and I was training the staff in the small towns in my state. One night after work, I was driving to the next town, which was only a few hours away. By dusk, I was feeling too tired to continue, so I decided to stop for the night. When I looked it up on my phone, I found that there was a small motel along the highway, not far away. It looked like any other roadside motel, nothing fancy. It was just a low single-story building with a neon sign and a mostly empty parking lot. At that point, I didn't care about the amenities. I just wanted a bed and a few hours of sleep before hitting the road again in the morning. After checking in, I got my key and headed to my room. It was overlooking the parking lot, and inside it was pretty standard. There was one bed and an old TV with a bathroom in the corner. I tossed my bag on the chair by the window, took a shower, and collapsed onto the bed. The day had been long, and I was looking forward to getting a decent night's sleep before work the next day. The parking lot was quiet when I came in. A few other cars were scattered around, but there wasn't much activity. I could see the occasional passing car on the highway, but other than that, it was dead quiet. I turned off the lights, got under the covers, and fell asleep almost immediately. But at around 2:30 a.m., I woke up to the sound of loud, frantic knocking on my door. It startled me awake, and for a second, I wasn't sure if it was real or part of a dream. But the knocking continued, so I sat up and tried to make sense of it. I glanced at the clock, feeling groggy and confused, but the sound didn't stop. Whoever it was showed no signs of giving up. Then I listened for any voices, but all I heard was the knocking. I got up, but I was still half asleep, and just then, the knocking stopped, but I still walked over to the door and looked through the peephole. Strangely, no one was there. I stood there for a moment trying to figure out what was going on. I called out and asked who it was, but no one answered. I debated whether I should open the door or just ignore it, but curiosity got the better of me. I turned on the light and carefully opened the door, leaving the chain on. When I looked out, all I found was an empty walkway. I looked around, but there definitely wasn't anybody there. It wouldn't have been hard for someone to sneak around the corner and hide, but why? At that moment, I was pretty sure my mind was playing tricks on me. I had never had a dream so vivid before, though, so it was weird. Before going to bed, I took off the chain lock and opened the door all the way. The parking lot in front of me looked as it had when I first checked in. Nobody was there. I shut the door and locked it again. I tried to forget it and go back to sleep, but it was hard to ignore the strange feeling that someone was there. After a few minutes, I managed to calm down and convince myself it was nothing. But just as I was about to fall asleep again, the knocking came back, and it was just as loud as before. This time I was sure that it was real. By then I was mostly awake, and there was no way that it was in my head. I got up and walked to the window, then pulled back the curtain slightly to peek outside. That's when I saw him. There was a man standing about 5 car lengths away in the parking lot. He was just barely visible under one of the lights. He wasn't moving, just standing there staring at my room. I couldn't make out his face from that distance, but the sight was creepy. I didn't know what to do, because I couldn't really call the cops. In fact, I couldn't even prove that he was the one banging on my door. I grabbed my phone and called the front desk. The night clerk picked up. I blurted out my story, probably sounding insane. The front desk guy said that he'd check it out, but it sounded like he didn't really take it seriously. I hung up and watched as the clerk came outside with a flashlight and scanned the area. But by the time he arrived, the man was gone. I didn't sleep much after that. I couldn't stop thinking about that man and why he'd been standing there staring at my room. When the sun finally came up, I packed up my things as quickly as I could and checked out. I'm thankful that nothing really bad happened, but his intentions couldn't have been good. It was the middle of the night, and some random stranger was banging on my door. I still wonder what he would have done if I was stupid enough to open up for him. I started working the night shift at a motel about 10 years ago, when I was 30 years old. It has been years since I quit, but this is about a creepy experience that I still think about to this day. I was used to the night shift already before I took the job, because I was doing night security. Since I was already used to the sleep schedule, it seemed to make sense. The job was easy most of the time. I'd check in a few people, maybe 4 or 5, and then spend the rest of the night catching up on paperwork or reading a book. The motel was on a highway, so we got a lot of people just passing through. Truck drivers, road trippers, and the occasional family. It had 20 rooms, a small lobby, and a vending machine that was always out of order. The owner didn't put much money into the place, so everything had a bit of a worn-out feel. It was clean enough though for the most part, and the guests usually didn't ask for much. It was a cheap place, so I guess they had low expectations. The only real downside was the isolation. The motel was about 20 miles outside of town, and there wasn't much around except for a few gas stations and a diner that closed at midnight. I didn't see many people, and when I did, it was usually just for a quick check-in. Most nights, I was the only person awake for miles. It could get a little eerie, especially on those nights when there wasn't a single guest and the whole place felt deserted. I got used to it over time, though, and the routine became familiar. I never expected much to happen, and for the first 6 months nothing really did. But then one night, a little after 1 in the morning, I was sitting at the front desk which had a window facing the parking lot. I looked up and saw a man walking through the sparse collection of cars out front. He was on foot, which was unusual. Most people who stayed at the motel arrived by car. In fact, I'm not even sure how you could get there on foot. I watched him for a moment, trying to figure out what he was doing. There wasn't much around except for the highway, so it was strange to see someone just walking around like that. He was a young guy, maybe in his mid-20s, and he was dressed in dark clothes. He didn't look particularly threatening, but something about the way he moved made me uneasy. He wasn't in a hurry, just strolling through the lot like he had all the time in the world. He wasn't drunk. I would have known if he was. I decided that it would be a good idea to be prepared, just in case, so I walked over to the gun safe that we kept in the office. We had a small 9mm handgun in there for protection. It was a requirement from the owner after a break-in a few years back. I wasn't a fan of guns, but I knew how to handle one if I needed to. I took it out and placed it on the filing cabinet behind the counter, making sure it was within easy reach. Then I looked back up at the door. The man walked into the office a moment later. He wasn't doing anything particularly scary. He was just a normal-looking guy walking into the room. The only thing that worried me at that moment was the fact that I didn't see his car pull up. Other than that, I just had a weird feeling. He didn't say anything right away. He just stood there looking around. I said hi to him and asked if he needed a room. He looked over to me and nodded his head yes, but didn't approach the counter. He was still standing by the door, with his hands in his pockets, looking over towards me. I could feel the tension building, and my hand moved subtly toward the gun, just in case. Finally, after what must have been a few minutes, he looked at me and said, "Thank you." Then he walked out just like that. No explanation, no room, nothing. He just left. I was left standing there feeling unsettled, but I told myself it was probably nothing and went back to my desk. I tried to forget it and go back to what I was doing, but I was pretty confused about that guy. The whole encounter had been strange, and the more I thought about it, the more uneasy I felt. I kept glancing out the window, half expecting the guy to come back, but he never did. I was about to put the gun back in the safe when headlights blasted in through the front window. 2 police cars pulled into the parking lot. They stopped right in front of the office, and a couple of cops got out. One of them walked up to the counter, and the other started looking around the lot. The officer at the counter asked if I had seen anything strange that night. I immediately thought of the man who had come in earlier, and I told them about him. He heard me out, and then went to get his partner. When he came back, he told me they were searching for a suspect in an armed robbery that had happened in town earlier that night. The description they gave me matched the man I had seen almost perfectly. For the rest of my shift, I couldn't stop thinking about the man and what might have happened if things had played out differently. The next morning, when my shift ended, I went home and tried to sleep, but of course, I was thinking about it the whole time. Even years later, I sometimes wonder what made him change his mind and walk away. Maybe he saw me reach for the gun, but I wouldn't have thought he could tell from that angle. Either way, I dodged a bullet that night, and I never had to find out what he was capable of.